Minutes, I open the Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thank you all for coming out this morning. As Corey mentioned, I'm going to talk about multilateralism a la Russe, which is to try and give a little bit of sense of how the major multilateral organizations that Russia is sponsoring in the region are performing, and taking a look at recent developments as a lens for trying to draw some longer-term conclusions about the opportunities and the challenges that they face. I'm going to focus mainly on the Eurasian Economic Union. I'll say a little bit about the CSTO, and I think Richard is actually going to say more about it. So yes, intentionally brilliant composition of the panel. Thank you. But in both cases, right, I mean, there is a kind of underlying vision, and it's not necessarily a new one, even though the Eurasian Economic Union was only founded a little bit more than a year ago. If you think about it, Russia's strategy in the post-Soviet space since, and I hate that term, but I'm going to use it, going back to the 1990s has, to some degree, centered on the idea of keeping these states together in some form or fashion, and at the very least preserving, and in some cases even rebuilding, institutional and political linkages among them. Now, this is not a process that's unique to this part of the world. Obviously, regionalization is an important topic in a number of other parts of the world now, especially as an alternative to some of the roadblocks that globalization, the Doha round, for example, are facing. And as a result, we're seeing the emergence of regional economic institutions, regional economic blocks, including on the part of the United States with initiatives like the TPP and the TTIP. So what's happening in Eurasia with the Eurasian Economic Union in some ways fits into a pattern that we're seeing elsewhere, but it also dates back much further. At the same time, I think there's another difference here, which is that unlike a lot of other multilateral fora that we talk about, ASEAN, for example, or APEC or the EU, the model is different. The relationship among the different players is different. The Eurasian Economic Union in particular is much more of a hub and spokes model, with Russia at the center and the other post-Soviet states occupying the different spokes, rather than a kind of alliance of equals. And you can see this if you look at, for example, the disparities in the size of the relative economies, with Russia accounting for 85% of the EU's total GDP. Russia's population is 8 times larger than Kazakhstan, which is the second largest. So there is this balance, and you see it in the way that the institution operates. Moreover, if you look at the trade flows, right, they're not relatively evenly distributed among the countries themselves. Rather, it reinforces this notion of a hub and spokes, with a much higher percentage of bilateral trade occurring between Belarus and Russia, Kazakhstan and Russia, Kyrgyzstan and Russia, rather than between Kazakhstan and Belarus, or Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. And so this is a basic structural feature of the organization that says something about the opportunities and challenges that it faces. It also hits at what remains, I think, the fundamental challenge, which is that the objectives of the member states only coincide to a relatively limited degree, and certainly I would say less so than in ASEAN, and despite all its fractiousness in the last year or so, I'd say even more so than vis-a-vis the EU. And I want to go over how the divergence of objectives among the member states has been visible in the last year or so since the formal founding of the Eurasian Economic Union, and what that says about the longer-term prospects. As we know, the Eurasian Economic Union grew out of a number of precursor organizations, again keeping with this idea that preserving and strengthening multilateral linkages among the post-Soviet states has been a topic of discussion going back to the 1990s, right? I mean, the Commonwealth of Independent States itself, the successor of the Soviet Union, was in some ways designed to prevent the complete rupture of a lot of these linkages that threatened to collapse along with the Soviet Union itself. So given that history, given the fact that there's been some degree of this multilateralism in the post-Soviet region since the 1990s, what makes the current iteration of it different? And I would argue that the biggest difference is the creation of centralized institutions with power to set the agenda on a number of key economic policy issues affecting all of these states, and the invocation of the supranational model, which in the discussions of the Eurasian Economic Union's founding is alleged to be based on the model of the European Union, which is to say that states that are members of the organization actually cede some of their sovereignty to the supranational commission that is set up to direct the operations of the Union as a whole. And in that sense, moving well beyond the level of integration that existed with previous institutional incarnations of multilateralism in the post-Soviet region. And the Commission has powers to regulate a whole range of economic activities, including trade agreements, currency policy, energy policy, subsidies, migration, transit, and the like. Now, its ability to actually follow through on these competencies remains very much a matter of contention. At the same time, there have been trial balloons that have been floated at different times for other supranational institutions and powers that so far have not been approved because of the opposition that they faced in some of the smaller member states, particularly in this context, Kazakhstan. And here there are ideas like having a common currency or having a common court of human rights acting as a kind of alternative to the European Court of Justice. So what's happened recently, and what are some of the developments that bear watching, and some of the bigger lessons that we can take from them? 2015 was a very active year. Of course, it marked the formal founding of the Eurasian Economic Union. But additionally, the Union expanded beyond its initial membership base, taking in Kyrgyzstan and Armenia. Free trade agreements were negotiated with Vietnam, and additional agreements are being discussed with other partners, including China, Israel, and others. The Commission adopted a number of laws, some on seemingly mundane issues like common regulation of pharmaceuticals, but also on some potentially more expansive areas like a common foreign exchange market, and potentially on the creation of a common energy market, which would address one of the biggest concerns of some of the non-Russian participants, which is their ability to access the Russian pipeline infrastructure. Now, whether these regulations will be translated into practice remains to some degree an open question. At the same time, though, even as we've seen this, both broadening and deepening, to use EU terminology, of the Eurasian Economic Union over the last year, we've seen also some of the structural challenges that it faces. One of the biggest, in part because of the centrality of Russia to the overall organization, is the vulnerability of the entire Eurasian Economic Union to political and economic shocks in Russia itself. Of course, Russia had a difficult year economically in 2015. The economy shrank about 3.7%, largely on the back of lower oil prices, but also the impact of sanctions. And given the vulnerability of these other countries because of their dependence on Russia, there were knock-on effects, which also had the political impact of dampening what enthusiasm existed for deeper integration on the part of Astana, Bishkek, Yerevan, and Minsk. So you had a decline in remittances in countries like Kyrgyzstan, which are very dependent on remittances from Russia for their overall economic performance. There's a decline in exports to Russia, largely as a result of the decline of the ruble and the more difficult terms of trade that resulted. And in response to these challenges, you actually saw the emergence of the creation of new, particularly non-tariff barriers on the part of some of the smaller states, including Belarus and Kazakhstan. So if the entire goal of economic integration is to reduce barriers to trade and create a common trade area, the reimposition of sanitary checks, limits on types of goods that can be imported, customs inspections on the borders and the like, is actually a move in the other direction, and I would argue is a direct consequence of the fact that Russia plays such a central role in this overall union that when Russia sneezes, the rest of the countries catch a cold. At the same time, of course, there was the response of the other countries to the sanctions and the counter-sanctions that Russia imposed over the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for especially the counter-sanctions that Russia imposed on, for example, food imports from the European Union, and conscious efforts were made in some of these countries to bypass the sanctions. And that, of course, led to Russia then seeking to crack down on the importation into Belarus and Kazakhstan of, say, Italian cheese and then its re-export into Russia. Again, the result being that you had reduction of the level of integration rather than an increase in it. I think perhaps an even more significant development was the adoption by the Eurasian Economic Commission of a protocol to address the fact that Kazakhstan was becoming a member of the World Trade Organization, and then Kazakhstan negotiating binding tariff lines within the WTO that were lower than those that it was supposed to enforce as part of its membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. And as a result, the Eurasian Economic Union itself had to pass a special protocol which basically makes it more difficult for Kazakhstan to re-export goods that have been brought into Kazakhstan from third countries at the lower WTO-bound tariff rates to Russia and to the other countries. So again, trying to penalize member countries for building economic linkages with the outside world and forcing them to make these kind of compromises in a way that is beneficial to Russia but is less beneficial for these countries themselves. And this is an indication, I think, of how the basic interests of the participants in the Eurasian Economic Union in important ways don't align. Russia is an industrial power. I mean, we think of it in the West largely as a natural resource state, but it is, compared to the other countries in the Eurasian Economic Union, a large industrial power that produces primarily for export to those markets. For these other countries, which are not major industrial powers and are more import dependent, of course, the interest in tariff-fund trade policy doesn't necessarily overlap. And partially for this reason, the Eurasian Economic Union spent a lot of 2015 trying to negotiate a common customs code, which it was unable to do by the end of the year, largely because of objections from Kazakhstan. Again, because the basic interests of the sides don't coincide. One of the things that the Union did accomplish during the year, incidentally, was signing an agreement with, or agreeing with China on integrating the integration projects, the Eurasian Economic Union and the Silk Road Economic Belt, which was announced in May of 2015. This integration was a high priority for Russia for larger sort of geopolitical reasons, but a number of the Central Asian countries were very worried because they saw it as threatening their ability to generate tax and customs revenue from Chinese goods that were being traded across the Silk Road Economic Belt that would be going through their own countries. And so the loss of revenue threatens to deprive them of an important source of government and other budget revenues. So there's a lot of disconnect here between the interests and the goals of Russia, which again accounts for 85% of the Union's GDP, and some of the smaller countries. Okay, that's the Eurasian Economic Union. I want to say just a bit about the CSTO, because even though it has a separate function, I think part of Moscow's vision in particular is developing greater coordination among these different integration projects. And it's a vision that not only exists in Moscow. In fact, when Armenia made the decision to become a member of the Eurasian Economic Union in 2013, Armenian President Serge Sargsyan said in no uncertain terms, it's impossible to be a member of one security system and another economic system. Because Armenia is part of the CSTO and depends on the CSTO for its security, the argument was that it therefore had to be part of this economic system that overlay the same group of states. Now the CSTO has also been quite active. In particular, has developed more of a focus on terrorism as the situation in Afghanistan deteriorated and has taken more steps, which I assume Richard is going to discuss to some degree, to help counteract these challenges, including exercises and drills designed to deal with what member states are worried about in terms of the spread of terrorism across the border. At the same time, you have some of the same problems with incompatible interests among the member states within the CSTO as well. And here again, I think Armenia is a good example, where at the CSTO meeting in December, Sargsyan complained about the close ties that all the other CSTO members maintained with Azerbaijan at a time when the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh and along the line of contact was becoming more and more dangerous. The CSTO's position on Nagorno-Karabakh is it should be resolved politically, which of course, since one of the parties to the conflict is a member of the CSTO and the other is not, rankles at least in the capital of the country that is a member. And again, hints at this question of whether or not there's a common vision. Similarly, if you start thinking about counterterrorism cooperation in Central Asia, I think it's an open question what the response of governments in Belarus and Armenia in particular would be. Now, Belarusian and Armenian troops did participate in the counterterrorism exercises in May 2015, but if push comes to shove, I think it's an open question whether they would be willing to actually engage in military operations connected with insecurity coming from Afghanistan or Central Asia. Now, the CSTO is trying to develop a collective security strategy to 2025. It hasn't been published yet, but discussions are underway, and if and when a draft is published, I think it'll be very interesting to see how it seeks to resolve some of these tensions. So overall, when you think about multilateralism a la Russe in this region, there remains a fundamental tension between Russia's vision of what integration is for and how the smaller states which are participating more or less willingly in these integration projects see the goal of participating in them themselves. Russia, of course, and we can talk more about this in the discussion, sees integration in part as a strategy for establishing its role in a multipolar global world. Whereas for countries like Kazakhstan, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia, it's much more about concrete benefits of deepening integration among themselves. It's what's in it for me in terms of economic performance, in terms of security, cooperation, and the like. And squaring that circle remains, in many ways, the biggest challenge that both of these organizations face. There's also the question of exclusivity, which develops out of the same dilemma. To the extent that Russia sees these organizations as part of a strategy for balancing in a multipolar world, it would prefer that countries that are members of them are members only of these organizations and limit their participation in other potentially competing groups or multilateral bodies. Whereas for the smaller countries, the challenge is figuring out how do you balance participation in groups like the Eurasian Economic Union with efforts to have cooperation, both bilateral and multilateral, outside of the group. One foreign diplomat that I was interviewing recently put it this way. He said that from one of the smaller states, said that for us, participation in the Eurasian Economic Union is a strategic choice. Russia wants to see it as a civilizational choice, but we don't. And I think if there's any takeaway from the experience of 2015 in the functioning of both the EEU and the CSTO, it is precisely that, the tension between whether these organizations require their smaller members to make a fundamental civilizational choice at a time when Russia's relationship with the West in particular is increasingly strained. Thanks.